RESTful APIs can be built with a variety of technologies and patterns. We are going to use ASP.NET Core 6 and the MVC, which stands for Model View Controller pattern. I assume that you already know a bit about ASP.NET Core, as that's one of the core's prerequisites. Nevertheless, it may be interesting to have a look at how the MVC pattern maps to building APIs. MVC is an architectural software pattern for implementing user interfaces. Different interpretations exist, but in all interpretations, it's used to encourage loose coupling and separation of concerns. That then allows for better testability of your application and the ability to reuse parts of it. Mind you, it isn't the full application architecture, just like REST isn't. Typically, MVC is used in the presentation layer, and that's about it. Hence the implementing user interfaces part of the definition. But how do we map this to an API then? Well, an API can also be regarded as a user interface, the interface to the consumer of the API. Let's do that. So, MVC consists of three main parts. The model handles the logic for your application data. A model in this sense can contain code to retrieve or store data at that level. In some implementations, view models are used as a model. These contain code to retrieve or store data. In quite a few implementations, the model doesn't contain any logic at all. It's another component of your application that handles this, for example, the business layer. That model, that's the DTOs used by an API. These DTOs are serialized into response bodies, or in RESTful terminology, resource representations. The view represents the parts of the application that handles the display of data. When building an API, this view should be regarded as the representation of our data or resources. And more often than not these days, that is JSON. And the controller then handles the interaction between the view and the model, including handling user input. In the API world, this user that interacts with the API is the API consumer, and that is typically another application. If we look at the dependencies between these components, we see that both controller and view depend on the model, and the controller also depends on the view. That's one of the key benefits of this separation. In other words, the controller chooses the view to display to the user, and it provides the view with any model data the view requires. So, when a request is made by an API consumer, an action on the controller will be triggered. The controller sends any data that's inputted, like query string parameters, to the part of the application responsible for business or data access logic. It then returns a model to the view. And that view, in this case, is the resource representation, in JSON, for example. So this is what we're going to use to create a truly RESTful API. It's very important to know that we don't just get a RESTful API out of the box just because we're building an API with ASP.NET Core. Ensuring the API, or the system as a whole, is RESTful is our responsibility. And we get that by adhering to a set of constraints. We will learn about those soon. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're not starting from scratch in this course. We're starting from an OK web API. Let's see what that looks like.